Hello and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Material Efficiency Strategies for Business, Untapped Climate Solutions for Buildings Mobility, organized jointly with the International Resource Panel, the United Nations Environment Programme, and in partnership with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and World Economic Forum. I'm Hannes McNulty, Green Industry Advisor at the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, and I would like to thank you very much for being here with us today. Now, before we get started, I would like to take a very brief moment to introduce the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP as it is better known. This is a global network of experts and organizations dedicated to providing the policy, business, and finance communities with knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy. Now, if you're not already familiar with the GGKP, I would encourage you to visit any of our 3 knowledge platforms most relevant to your interests: the policy-focused Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the Green Finance Platform, and the Green Industry Platform. You can also consider signing up to our newsletter at ggkp.org/subscribe. Now, I'm excited to announce that the GGKP is soon launching the Green Forum. This is an online community space for sharing and discussing insights on a range of themes and issues related to a sustainable economic transformation. There'll be really lots of discussion on material efficiency on this Green Forum, so do stay tuned. But now back to our webinar for this afternoon. We are very fortunate to be joined by sustainability leaders from around the globe. And we'd encourage you, the audience members, to submit questions and comments throughout today's discussion. At the end of the day, it's a fantastic opportunity for you to engage directly with this really good panel of experts. After the webinar, we'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey, as your feedback really will be of big help to us in shaping future webinars. Please also note that a full recording of the webinar will be available on our website at ggkp.org shortly after the broadcast. At this time next week, you can also join us for a webinar organized jointly with the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, which will present and discuss a guide to designing high-performing eco-industrial parks for donors, governments, and park managers. We look forward to welcoming you to this and future events. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Yanis Potočnik, co-chair of the International Resource Panel and partner at System IQ. Yanis has extensive global experience on a range of issues. Among other roles, Yanis is an advisor to thought-leading institutions such as the European Forest Institute and has served as European Commissioner for the Environment and for Science and Research. In 2013, he received the United Nations Champions of the Earth Award. So without further ado, Yanis, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hannes. Dear all, thank you very much for joining this webinar today with the title Material Efficiency Strategies for Business, Untapped Climate Solutions in Buildings and Mobility. The webinar is hosted, as you have heard, by the Green Growth Knowledge Platform and the United Nations International Resource Panel, who will launch its latest report in the coming minutes. A short introduction to the International Resource Panel. The panel was funded in 2007 by UNEP, a science policy interface not too different from IPCC and IPBES, the other UN-based science policy interfaces in the area of climate and biodiversity. The panel brings together about 40 top scientists from around the world, and it's guided by a steering committee of approximately the same number of government representatives. The aim of the panel is to advance science-based information about sustainable natural resources management for decision makers in policy and also in business. My name, as you have heard, is Yanis Potočnik, and I'm a co-chair of the panel. So why we are here today? There is an enormous urgency for climate action and the increasing commitment by countries and business to such action. The European Union, for example, has just recently committed to a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. To achieve this rapid and deep decarbonization, all potential solutions need to be exploited. Climate debates so far have mostly focused on cleaner energy production, which is of course important, but overlooks also an important potential of material efficiency strategies. Material efficiency strategies mean that resource-intensive provisioning systems, such as housing and vehicles, can be designed to deliver high-quality services at much lower material base, be it through linear design, better recycling of materials, better repair of using different materials, and so on. These practices naturally save materials and their embodied emissions, but they save also energy from heating or driving. And for smart businesses, material efficiency strategies offer opportunities for lasting competitiveness in a future market that will be shaped by resource scarcity and consumer demands for sustainable and convenient services. I'm therefore delighted about this event that brings together the lead authors of this report, two of our distinguished IRP scientists, with four highly relevant speakers from industry and finance. Two of IRP strategic partners have supported the organization of this event today. So many thanks to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and to the World Economic Forum. In the first part of this webinar, IRP members Edgar Hertwich and Reid Lifset will present the IRP publication, Resource Efficiency and Climate Change, Implications for Business Leaders. This document combines a synthesis of the findings from the scientific study with ideas from IRP strategic partners about the business opportunities of material efficiency. In the second part of this webinar, we have the honor to welcome our panelists. We have with us Christoph Wolff, Head of Shaping the Future of Mobility at the World Economic Forum. Kristina Church, Head of Sustainable Solutions at Lombard Odier Investment Managers. Martin Pauly, Foresight Consulting Lead at Arup. And Anirban Ghosh, Head of Sustainability of Mahindra Group. I greatly look forward to your insights and to the fruitful debate. We have worked quite for a while on this report to make it useful and also to build the trust among involved, all us in this exercise. Like it or not, at the end, we have the same task. And it is not anymore about who and when, it is rather about how. We hope this report will help us answer this question. And now, over to you, Edgar and Reid. Next 20 minutes are yours to present the report.
Thank you, Jan. It is a pleasure to present this report. My name is Edgar Hertwich. As Jan said, I'm a professor of energy and process engineering at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I was a lead author on this study. Next slide, please. So my part is to present the science of you in terms of the modeling exercises that we have conducted about the potential role of material efficiency within the areas of buildings, residential buildings, and cars. Next slide, please. So you wonder why we're looking at materials. My previous role, when I worked for the last IPCC report, I was a lead author in the energy chapter. But it turns out that it's not only about energy. In fact, some of the most difficult to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the production of materials, and only part of those emissions are associated with the use of energy. Another part of those emissions are associated with chemical processes in the production of the materials. Emissions from the production of materials have grown from 5 billion tons per year in 1995 to 11.5 billion tons in 2015. And in fact, they have continued to grow
but the latest numbers are not yet in. Now they constitute 23% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which is about equivalent to the combined emissions of agriculture, forestry, and land use change, another topic that has seen a lot of attention recently. The most important materials in terms of causing greenhouse gas emissions in their production are iron and steel and other metals, cement, and other non-metallic minerals, mostly used in construction processes. Also, a certain role is played by plastics and rubber and by wood production. I should say in the wood production here, we do not include emissions from deforestation that might be associated with harvesting the wood products. Next slide here. So in this work, we have actually looked for opportunities to use materials more efficiently so that we could reduce the amount of materials that are required. And there are different options for doing that. So we have looked at the whole life cycle of products. And it is, of course, important to look at the whole life cycle because the materials would come back at the end of life. And so we have looked at using less materials by designing products more efficiently or lighter products, substituting the use of existing emissions intensive products, materials with materials that are less emissions intensive, such as using wood instead of reinforced concrete in the construction of buildings, reducing the amount of waste that is associated with the production process, for example, at construction sites, through higher yields, using products more intensively. That means providing services for more people from the same amount of products, and therefore requiring less products to provide the aggregate services that are requested by society, extending the lifetime of products, thereby also increasing the amount of service that is delivered by each individual product, the recovery of parts from disused products, their remanufacturing or otherwise reuse of those components, and then finally enhanced collection and end-of-life recycling of the products. All of those strategies might potentially reduce the requirement for emissions-intensive materials. Next slide, please. So we have specifically looked at two sectors that are important. One of the sectors is buildings. And buildings are always known to be important because they cause significant energy consumption. But it's not only that they require a lot of energy, they are also the largest sink of materials in our society, or the most important materials use. And this here is numbers for the G7 countries. It was the G7 that actually requested this study, so we quantify those industrialized countries. In 2016, you see that there was 1.2 billion tons of CO2 equivalents that was associated with the energy use of those buildings, and 250 million tons that was associated with the materials that went into constructing the buildings and maintenance and replacement of parts in the buildings. And then we assume that there is a 2-degree pathway that we are on in terms of decarbonizing the energy supply and increasing energy efficiency in the economy. And if we spin this 2-degree pathway forward with the anticipated demand for residential floor space, we come to the middle bar here, which indicates that there would be about a 50 to 60% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is good, but nowhere near to what we would need in order to meet the Paris degree targets. Please forward. Let's see that the animations work. Yes. And if we apply the material efficiency strategies that we have looked at, we could achieve a further 35% reduction of those life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And these reductions are about equally distributed across reduced material use and reduced energy consumption. Of course, the energy consumption would go down because more intensive use of floor space means that less floor space needs to be heated and cooled. Forward, please. Next slide. The situation in China and India is very different. As you can see, 2016 on the left hand, we have about equal emissions from the materials required to produce buildings and the energy use in the buildings. And this is associated both with the fact that there is a lower energy use per square meter in these countries, partly associated with the different climate, and that there is a much higher rate of new construction of buildings, therefore a much higher requirement of materials for building construction. In 2050, if we employ these clean energy strategies of improved energy efficiency and renewable energy supply, we could bring those emissions down again by about half. And by then, we would expect that emissions from materials production are more important than those from the supply of energy. Forward, please. And if we then apply the material efficiency strategies that we have investigated, we would get a full 60% reduction of life cycle emissions associated with residential buildings in China and India. And this reduction is so large because the construction of new buildings is the dominant source of emissions. You can see again here that we would bring emissions associated with materials production significantly down, and that would be by far the largest reduction in this specific case. Now, if we forward, please, we look at the if we forward, please, we look at which strategies are most important here in the case of G7 countries. And by far the most important strategy would be more intensive use. That means in our case requiring about 20% less building space per capita than the otherwise would be required according to our growth path. And so you can see that this is a really significant strategy. Other important strategies are improved recycling and the use of wood as a construction material. And now we can move forward and look at cars. For cars, we can see that most of the current emissions are associated with energy consumption, not only in driving the car, but in making the car and producing the gasoline that is used in the car, and that materials are a fairly small part here, despite the fact that for overall metal consumption, car production is actually an important sink of materials. If we assume the implementation again of these clean energy strategies and the gradual shift towards electric vehicles with a relatively clean electricity supply, we can see that there's a substantial reduction in emissions that we would expect by 2050. And if we, on top of that, apply material efficiency strategies, forward please, we can see that there is also about a 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in addition to the one that can be attained through clean energy strategies that these material efficiency strategies provide. And again, the material consumption would go substantially down, and there would also be a saving of emissions related to the use of energy in those vehicle life cycles. Forward, please. And that was for the G7 countries. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Now we shift the gear to China and India. China and India today have much lower emissions from the use of cars than the G7 countries, despite the fact that they have a much higher population. And that is because there are fewer cars, and the cars are driven on average much less than in G7 countries. You have a relatively higher use of materials because the car stock is increasing, and there's less driving, and so that also plays a role. So we expect that even with the shift towards electric vehicles and clean energy supply, there would be a substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions in our scenario by 2050. And forward, please, if we then apply the material efficiency strategies, the relative reductions would be about the same as in the G7 countries. So in this case, 35% reduction of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. Next slide, please. And so going back to the G7 countries and looking at the different strategies, how much does each strategy contribute to the emissions reductions? We can see that more intensive use is the most important. That is through ride sharing. That means having more people share a ride in the same direction, or car sharing, where people use a car after each other. And in addition, shifting towards smaller trip appropriate vehicles is important. And it actually turns out that in practice, the car sharing and the smaller vehicle sizes go hand in hand. A lot of users buy or car owners buy large vehicles because they occasionally use a car vehicle. Now, if you don't own a car, but you rather share a fleet with other users, you always use a smaller car on the trips where you don't need to carry a heavy load or transport a lot of people. And so the experience is that with car shared fleets, the average car is actually smaller than in privately owned individual car fleets. And so the other strategies are actually not that important. It was somewhat of a surprise to us, but we found out that already existing recycling, both for cars and for vehicles, are quite important in reducing emissions. But these are already occurring. So with that, I would like to end the part that concerns the quantitative modeling results. And back to you, Jans. Thank you. Now over to you, Reid. Sorry.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Reid Lifset. I'm a research scholar at the Yale School of the Environment and a resident fellow in industrial ecology. I also am the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Industrial Ecology, the field that provides science for the circular economy. In the Implications for Business Leaders report, you'll find not only these modeling insights that Edgar described, but also ideas about what material efficiency strategies mean for business success in a future of climate change, resource scarcities, and changing consumer demands. To give a vision of material efficient business opportunities, we asked IRP strategic partners and their networks what material efficiency strategies mean for industry, innovation, and success. What are the opportunities for material efficiency in the markets of tomorrow? Among those that provided input were the World Economic Forum, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the International Chamber of Commerce, the Sun Institute, and Systemic, as well as their networks. One of the recurrent answers in the consultations was that there was a big opportunity for foresighted innovators who are willing to rethink business models, for example, by shifting from selling products to selling functionality and services. The message was also that current market conditions and policies do not incentivize material efficiency. Some policies, for example, keep the price of materials artificially low and therefore limit the competitive value of saving materials. I'll give a few examples of business opportunities that were suggested. However, I will not go into depth as this content can be read in the report, and today we want to hear about business perspectives directly from our panelists. Next, please. First, we asked visionary businesses in construction, development, and architecture what opportunities arise for them for material efficiency strategies. To recap, important material efficiency strategies from a climate perspective are the more intensive use of space, leaner designs, and use of alternative materials, as well as renovation if connected to strong improvements in building energy efficiency. In terms of business opportunities, material efficiency strategies can increase the productivity of existing buildings, save costs and time in new construction, and help meet the demand for new types of resident services. For example, multifamily houses are generally much more material and energy efficient than single-family houses. They also enable people to live in more compact neighborhoods with reduced commutes and better access to urban services, as well as lower energy bills. Therefore, the demand for space-efficient residences is rising in many places. Such space-efficient residences can also be sold in the form of individual flats, but they can also be offered in new business models of living services. Such services would include the maintenance of residences and additional services such as access to green community spaces or shared transportation stations. For the provider of such services, long-term material savings through better design and maintenance at scale would be more beneficial for business models, more beneficial than business models of simply one-off sales. Such models could be realized, for example, through housing cooperatives or other forms of shared ownership. Such models not only enhance the benefit of material savings, but could also enable more flexible upsizing and downsizing between units, and therefore a much more overall efficient use of space. When it comes to new construction, modular and prefabricated designs promise material cost and time savings. New building techniques for using timber, for example, with cross-lamination, can reduce the need for carbon-intensive building materials and also allow the construction of high-rise wood buildings. Digital tools such as building information modeling can further enhance the design of houses and the reduction of construction waste. Next slide, please. We also asked business stakeholders in the automotive and transportation industries about trends and opportunities in material efficient models. To recap here, important material efficiency strategies from a climate perspective are, again, more intensive use of vehicles through pooling and sharing, lighter and smaller vehicles, and maintenance and remanufacturing in the case of electric cars. Most businesses that were consulted underlined that while many pooling and sharing models are struggling to be profitable, the growth in consumer demand it's undeniable. In large urban centers, the cost per trip is already cheaper when using shared services than using individual cars. Plus, more and more consumers do not want the cost and effort of maintaining a privately owned vehicle. And the cost per trip is likely to decline with further advancing automation. The increase in sharing models and fleet management can go hand in hand with better value retention from investment in sophisticated technology because of faster return through shorter product cycles. Plus, higher utilization of vehicles makes it cost-effective for fleet managers to demand design from manufacturers for easy repairability and fast improvements in electrification and energy efficiency. Last but not least, pollution and congestion from private cars and mobility services is
We lost you, Reid. Can you repeat? We lost your voice.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, we are hearing you now. Thank you.
Sorry. Last but not least, pollution and congestion from private cars and mobility services is increasingly a focus of public concern and policy. To keep a social license to operate, it's important for mobility businesses to be an enabling element for a more sustainable transport system, for example, by lowering emissions, integrating with public transport, and sharing their data to enable more effective policy and planning. Next, please. While the opportunities for material efficiency are ample, not only is fundamental change necessary in business models, but also in policies incentivizing those shifts. The current IRP policy review identifies a gap of material efficiency policies in the G7 countries. Current policy and market conditions are not incentivizing the uptake of material efficiency strategies, and in some cases, even actively disincentivizing them. Let's have a quick look at the policy landscape and the changes that vocal business leaders should call for. Next, please. I'm having trouble with my slide. There we go. Okay, next, please. The policy review found only a limited number of existing policies directly or indirectly incentivizing material efficiency. You can read the extensive analysis in the main report. Those material efficiency policies that do exist mostly focus on landfill diversion. For example, recycling regulations. While that's certainly important, the modeling showed that for best carbon emissions mitigation, the design and use of houses and cars makes a greater difference than end-of-life policies. Current policies miss the link between material efficiency and climate perspectives. So, what are policies that can improve the design and use of houses and cars? For houses, building codes and standards are central to promote material efficiency strategies. For cars, these would include policies around sharing. In Chicago, for example, the city charges fees on individual ride hailing, but financially incentivizes the more efficient pooling. They are presumably doing this to reduce traffic congestion, but could connect it to climate and material policies for best impact. Next slide, please. In addition to calling for better policies in use and design, business leaders should call for a stop to policies that pose obstacles to material efficiency. In the housing sector, there are, for example, zoning laws that hinder the construction of multi-unit buildings in certain areas and which dictate large dwellings and building lots. Next slide, please. It's also important to look beyond sector-specific policies. Changing cross-cutting policies can be as important, if not more important. For example, many countries are still directly or indirectly subsidizing virgin material extraction, which keeps virgin material prices artificially low and which limits the competitiveness of more efficient practices. Also, it will be crucial for climate policies not only to target energy use, but also material use and the design of material-intensive provisioning systems, such as, of course, housing and mobility. For example, national plans for implementing the NDCs, the National Climate Pledges, will need both energy and material strategies. Next slide, please. To conclude, as a front-running business leader, it's important to anchor business vision in material efficiency and climate science, to invest in innovative policies and pilots, and to demand and support policy development. So, and my final slide, please. Thank you very much, and I greatly look forward to hearing our panelists' perspective on these findings.
Thank you very much to both of you, Edgar and Reid, for this, I think, important insights. In my view, unfortunately, most policymakers as well, also as business leaders, are still not aware of the benefit that material efficiency strategies can have on the climate. More intensive use strategies are almost entirely overlooked and by policy, and I suspect that also from many business strategies. So I'm delighted now to hear from our panelists who are actively implementing material efficiency strategies in the housing and mobility sectors, as well as also in the finance. We would like to welcome you to discuss the question, is there a business case for material efficiency? What are the biggest barriers to use and how they can be overcome? And how can business and policy cooperate to better implement these high impact strategies? Our first two panelists are focusing on material efficiency in mobility. So let me first ask a question to Christoph Wolff, head of Shaping the Future of Mobility at the World Economic Forum. Christoph, you led the World Economic Forum's work on mobility. The forum is a strategic partner of the International Resource Panel and also an official partner of this webinar. Long before this report, your work has focused on smarter, shared, and circular mobility. And you've recently also co-funded the Circular Cars Initiative. Which of the report findings are for you most relevant for the forum and also for the Circular Cars Initiative, and how will it help turn them into industry action? Christoph?
Yeah, Yannis, thank you very much, first of all, for having us, and it's a pleasure to co-sponsor with yourselves and others this important webinar. Let me say first, I think the most important conclusion from this work is to really show the connections between materials, resource effectiveness, and climate. Yeah, so this is actually often overlooked and not fully understood. And I think it's very important to bring data and science to this and research to this so it's better understood. Indeed, as a World Economic Forum, and I'm leading the work on mobility and transport that includes automotive and supply chain and aviation and shipping and all of that. So we are striving to work to a mobility future which is clean, safe, and inclusive. Yeah. So clean obviously has to do a lot with climate and resource efficiency. Within automotive, then, the framework that actually the industry has been talking to for years now is the ACES or CASE, depending on how you do the acronym. So autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And if you go to your own report, so the last two ones, the electric and shared, are very much reflected in the findings of that research. And why is that the case? Yeah, so and it very much and reflects the current paradigm of the industry that going to clean propulsion systems, such as electromobility, or in some segments maybe even hydrogen, green hydrogen, will make the difference. And we see that with enabled through policy, that electromobility is taking up speed. The European Commission has enhanced the policies. There's a fleet fuel standard policy, which actually has brought the car industry to 95 grams per kilometer in 2021, and that actually was only able if part of the fleet was actually electric. Yeah, the other part of this ACES is shared. Yeah, and again, in your findings, obviously you saw that a big lever is that today the 3% an asset, a car asset, is actually a very underutilized asset. So maybe 2 or 3% used, and obviously, and the rest is actually either sitting in, it's parking and taking space in cities, or it's actually used in single occupancy. So this is actually a very inefficient way of using. And therefore, we see actually a lot of business models out there, mobility as a service, that could be car sharing, ride sharing. So there's different models out there, and they're taking up in popularity, especially with millennials. So I have when my eldest son became 18, so he didn't want a car, even though he's an electric engineer. So he actually says, well, I don't find a parking, it's terribly expensive. And by the way, in Zurich, where he studies, there is a great bike share system. Yeah, so and it's actually for free. And so basically, there's a whole sharing economy. It takes incentives. And cities work on this all over the world. And actually, as a World Economic Forum, one of our lead initiatives on policy in that shared electric space is called the Global New Mobility Coalition. It has 200 members. and it works like a real policy led for cities. So how do you incentivize shared? Yeah, and it could be by financial incentives. It could be such as road pricing, parking fees. I mean, some cities actually close down streets, yeah, or they reduce parking space significantly. And they obviously improve public transit. All of that has to be done equitable, so that people that are need to use the cars can do it. But so cities basically work on this a lot. So one of the key policy frameworks is the so-called zero emission area. So cities basically starting from, in Europe you would say pedestrian areas. Yeah. So basically reserving inner cities only for pedestrians, and then they basically say this is like only electric cars can go in there, or electric distribution vehicles. And obviously, the economics have changed significantly. So the life cycle, the TCO perspective for high-use cars, for fleets, actually, electric cars are more economical than ICEs today. And then cities at the same time only allow the going to inner cities for electric cars, that has an air quality benefit, it has a quality of life benefit, and all of that, and then you spread it out, then actually you create a transition in a very practical manner. But I think the important one is, if you go to the other levers that you also mentioned in your report, and these are the material levers. And in the Circular Car Initiative that you were referring to, which actually is an initiative jointly by the WBCSD, Systemic, so by EU Climate Kick, and we're working together closely with McKinsey and Accenture. And we just actually issued a suite of 3 reports, and I will just come to that in a second. But the key element is, even if you go to electric and shared, what we said before, which basically means, battery electric to a large extent, then you're still actually down to 30% of today's life cycle emissions. And as a matter of fact, battery electric cars, from a material productivity, at today's way of basically building batteries, and without the fact that batteries can already run circular, because lithium-ion batteries running circular is actually putting them back into the production point is actually, production-wise still hard. Yeah. So without of that, and because the batteries are very energy intense to produce, so the car itself, the battery electric vehicles have been under criticism because actually the life cycle, the material part of the life cycle emissions is not tackled. Yeah, and so this is in order to get acceptance, in order to propel this forward. So the materials part of the electric of the vehicles need to be tackled. And in this Circular Car Initiative, we have done 2 main outputs. Yeah, so one output is that we created together with McKinsey a material cost curve. Yeah, so basically you ranked by cost efficiency, like the climate abatement curve that was available 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Basically, what are all the measures if you take a normal car in order to basically on the material side, yeah, if you redesign the car, if you use different materials, the green steel, yeah, so if you actually make the battery fully circular, if you use different cathode, anode material, so you basically go into measure by measure and say how much do they pay for themselves, how much do they cost, can they be unlocked through policy, etc. And so we produced a whole curve in order to basically get to really move to the zero carbon car, the zero carbon life cycle car, which actually is the ultimate goal of this. And if you see what BMW, Mercedes, Renault, and others are doing, so they are basically saying we now take ownership, also a responsibility of our supply chain as well. So what we want is not just basically move to electric cars. That is not far enough. We need to go to really the zero carbon car by 2040, and we need to actually tackle the whole supply chain. And I think this is actually a lot of rethink. BMW basically is a good example, Mercedes as well. Renault has basically transformed the whole plant towards circular circular productivity. It goes into the aftermarket. So companies like Nexus Automotive, they basically say we want to basically build a series of green workshops that actually act as a center where for the used car where actually supply parts could be remanufactured, supply parts could be exchanged, where predictive maintenance tells you when to do that. And we're basically to tackle the end of life business. We're working with the Circular Economy Initiative Germany, so which actually came out of their work and said there's actually an important thing is to create centers, competence centers, like Volkswagen is kind of proposing them, that actually are end-of-life competence centers where cars can be taken apart and actually and brought back into version use. So there's a lot of, we see a lot of action. With Accenture, we created a whole taxonomy on how to basically for each car to basically rank it according to its level of circularity, like you know from the autonomous, the move to autonomous, where you have level 1 to 5. So you want to establish circularity level 1 to 5. And there's a whole lot of thinking with that. So the Circular Car Initiative had like 70 to 80 companies supporting that. From the whole ecosystem. I think this is a case for collaboration across the whole value chain, from materials to OEMs, to suppliers, to recyclers, to banks, to including NGOs, obviously. And so we are very, so the reports actually just came out. I think my colleague may share some links to them, and they're very complementary to your own findings. So I want to congratulate you on this great work, and looking forward to collaborating further in the future.
Thank you, Christoph. That was very insightful. I think we will have more time to discuss it also in the Q&A later. Maybe just a very brief comment. You mentioned it also by yourself, and I think that one of the questions which I always try to underline when we talk about circularity is the fact that the ownership it's creating sometimes a bit of the problems, and I think that that young generation is less ownership biased than it was our generation, which is an opportunity for the transition. But on the other hand, whenever you are in that kind of a transition, it's essential that you offer alternatives. And if something is true, it is true that mobility transition is happening, and it's happening quite quickly. So
maybe on that one, if I can add like 2 sentences on that one. So indeed, the ingoing hypothesis into the Circular Car Initiative was that through these change of ownership models, mobility as a service, we get into a situation where actually individual assets get used much more intensely. So certainly 30% or so instead of 3%. That means that the life cycle is actually accelerated, and that means that actually the materials can be turned around much more quickly. Yeah. And because of then fleets taking ownership rather than individuals, so they become suddenly, the life cycle becomes an economical concern. So they will look about at the fact that when is it most rational actually to exchange and to recycle and to bring back to originals. And with that, I mean, with individual ownership, you see cars then floating into like secondary and tertiary markets with fleet ownership. I think this cycle can be managed much more tightly.
Yeah, this trend, I think it's quite present. The trend which is not present, and it's underlined very clearly also in the report, it's that lighter vehicles also create an opportunity on which it would be important to focus, because one can see that today in Europe it's a bit of a trend going to this SUVs direction, which is not exactly in line with that. But anyway, thank you, Christoph. You have mentioned yourself that bank cooperation in that context, it's also extremely important. That's why I'm now turning to Kristina. Kristina is the head of sustainable solutions at Lombard Odier Investment Managers, as I have mentioned before. Kristina, you currently work on sustainable solutions in finance, and you have extensive experience in the mobility sector also. How can the findings of this report help best drive investment in material efficient mobility? Kristina, please.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. I think I concur 100% with all of Christoph's comments there on the mobility space. And the report itself, I think what's really interesting about the report is that focusing on the full sustainability of mobility is so important. You know, up until now, we have seen a lot of focus maybe on electrification, on light duty vehicles, you know, focus on cars in the regulatory space and on tailpipe emissions. And what is so key here is to see that focus shifting towards circularity, manufacturing processes, resource efficiency. And these are all areas that we at Lombard Odier think are incredibly important for the revolution that we're seeing in the sustainability space. And in order to see finance moving and really moving towards more sustainable mobility and more sustainability across the spectrum, we believe there needs to be a transition to what we call a CLIC world. And CLIC is an acronym. It stands for circular, lean, inclusive and clean. And I think the report that is published today really does focus on the first two letters, the circularity and the leanness. But of course, when you add those into the mix, inclusivity comes along too, access to mobility for all, cheaper access, and the added bonus of cleaner mobility as well. So it all ties together. And this is for us a key area of focus. We are seeing, you know, very powerful forces driving this revolution, and it's lovely to see that we're at a pivotal point today, particularly in the mobility sector, because costs really have come down for a lot of the technologies that are enabling this transition. And once you can see that tipping point where manufacturers can make electric vehicles as profitably as battery electric cars, but also where consumers are coming and wanting this shift and in many cases demanding a shift, and whether that shift is more shared mobility or whether it's a shift to lighter forms of mobility towards micro mobility and electric bicycles and scooters, and maybe that shift has really been driven by helped a bit by the pandemic and the shift in mobility systems. But that is when investors can wake up and see opportunities to invest in this space, because costs have come down, and as Christoph mentioned, the cost abatement curves in the mobility sector, it is important to look at which technologies are going to give you the most returns, both in terms of the sustainability returns and a focus on cleaning the mobility system, but then you can see returns for investors as well, and that makes finance, you're able to mobilize a lot more money towards that. I do think there needs to be a focus in the regulatory space too, and on policies. We're seeing it at a local level. You know, again, Christoph mentions many cities are focusing on shifts in mobility patterns, de-emphasizing car usage, taking away car parking spaces. It's a very clean solution to shift people to other modes of mobility and sharing. What we don't want to see is that the pandemic has caused any negative shifts away from sustainable mobility. You know, currently there are healthcare concerns with more focus on shared mobility. We'd love to see that is a temporary shift and that people can become comfortable, because shared mobility encompasses public transport as well, much more sustainable options than an owned single-use vehicle that, as we've already discussed, can sit unutilized huge majority of the time. So I think we need to see a policy focus where it looks holistically across the full sustainability and encompasses natural capital, and encompasses the thinking about the mining of materials as well as the afterlife of materials, repurposing, reuse of batteries for second life. There's so many different concepts. So it is lovely to see that there is an academic focus and a scientific focus on other areas beyond the car solely, and beyond electrification, and thinking about the whole mobility cycle. And I think what I was really excited by with the report as well is seeing the link between the built world and mobility systems, because I think there is a very strong link, particularly in urban environments, that if you can start to rethink the mobility system and how we use space within cities, you can suddenly start thinking about what could that space, if it's not given away to infrastructure for the car, and we have fewer parking spaces and fewer roads for cars, what could that space be repurposed into? And could we have greener spaces and greener buildings within the built landscape? So it's nice to see those two areas being mirrored and brought into one discussion on the topic of circularity within the report.
Great, Kristina. Listen, one question I have more. What additional information or evidence would support the transition in more efficient mobility or housing? And what do you think? Should it come more from the scientific sources? We are hearing such a source today, or would it be best also to hear it from the best practice from the ground, for example, from somebody like the Circular Cars Initiative Christoph was presenting before, or is actually both very useful and needed?
I think it's the latter. I mean, we absolutely need it from as many directions as possible. In order to transition to a net zero world, we have to focus on hard to abate sectors. And I think in the finance industry, there has been up to date a little bit more of a focus on sort of low carbon solution providers to provide finance for those areas. But actually, we need more education for investors as well as consumers to understand that we still will need buildings and for the future. We still need transportation to move people and goods around, but we need to decarbonize both of those. And to set both on a decarbonized trajectory, we need to understand what those trajectories need to be, what solutions are available, where those solutions today are not cost effective or not at scale to make them investable. How can we encourage more investment into those areas? And is that policy? And of course, the more these areas are talked about, the more scientific research into what the best solutions are for those to decarbonize and to protect nature and all the sustainable demands that we have. It is absolutely vital to see it coming from every direction, from the press as well, and really good educated resources so that the consumers can see that they should want to move to mobility that's more sustainable and to live in buildings that are built in a long-standing sustainable way. And for me, that's very exciting to see it coming from multiple directions here, and we hope that continues.
Thank you, Kristina. You have actually very nicely connected the mobility part already with the part on which we would like to follow in the rest of the discussion with the two panelists which are still to contribute. So you said it very clearly that you actually very much like that they are both presented together because they are very much also interconnected. So now we are coming to the built environment, particularly residential housing, which is both resource intensive and also central to everyday societal well-being. Here I would like to in particular thank the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for partnering on this panel session and also for contributing to the report. So first I would like to ask a question to Martin Pauly, Foresight Consulting Lead at Arup, as explained before, who has been working with Ellen MacArthur Foundation on the circular economy in the built environment. Martin, what are your insights from the report for the built environment, and which industries could benefit most from these insights? Martin, please.
Yeah, thanks Yannis. Also thanks for having me and having us. So basically, the study confirms that there's a long needed shift away from pure energy efficiency lens towards a more life cycle thinking approach in the context of resources and carbon. I think that is absolutely the right direction. It also proves that frameworks like circular economy can be that kind of practical framework for the sector to meet the climate targets, because it just goes beyond just defining the targets. It provides actually a practical support. Before I answer the questions, maybe one sentence regarding Arup, because I believe that everyone knows Arup. We're a global engineering and consulting firm, being active mainly in cities, the energy, the infrastructure, and the water sector, and we're also a global partner to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Arup Foresight is a global team in Arup that helps public and private sector companies to understand and frame future trends and challenges that are related to our kind of built environment, and translate these into kind of initiatives and solutions. And obviously resource scarcity, circular economy are kind of one of the key transformation themes that are ahead of us. Other areas include labor shortage, digitization, and the overall low productivity. So there are a lot of, if you like, challenges. The key message for us was that the built environment sector shall use material resources more efficiently. The good news is, if we look in the past, the construction industry has kind of innovated often in the context of resource scarcity. To give you an example, post-war construction activities in the 50s and 60s, so kind of engineers, planners, designers had to use fewer materials were available. They had to adopt new techniques such as prefabrication to increase the productivity and use materials more efficiently. So that contextual framework, if you like, is not a new thing, and that's why we believe, or we are absolutely confident that the industry can also kind of meet and respond to the new challenges. So I think I'm here to contextualize the findings a bit, and the starting point is a look into the kind of reality of our industry. Unlike other industries, the AEC industry is kind of super fragmented. There are kind of hundreds of fragmented stakeholders, supply chains, value chains are fragmented, and there's a high pressure on cost and time. In a nutshell, we tend to say that every building is still a prototype, and that leads to kind of very low productivities in our industry. And that's why the kind of the connection of our industry and or let's say the perspective also on the automotive industry is relevant, because there are many things and aspects that also our industry could adopt. If we look a bit into the future, I mean, you mentioned it, there are a couple of very relevant distinctions. New construction versus how to treat existing buildings. In Europe, for instance, 95% is built, versus in emerging economies, there's still a large construction output of new buildings. So what we see is that designers and planners, architects, the entire industry is actually adopting circular economy as a framework. They're adopting the principles and strategy and literally rethink the way they're building. There's also a priority, if you like, of principles, and refusing to build new is probably at the highest level. Rethink the use of buildings, minimize the time of no use, design for durability, design for adaptability. You mentioned all these principles. In a nutshell, that requires a kind of holistic and system thinking approach. And it considers the building and its carbon emissions along multiple life cycles. And I think that's the new aspect also compared to other decades in the past. So there is a transition from energy efficiency towards a carbon perspective. So if we look at the industry and at different players, yes, they are adopting kind of new ways to design products. They are adopting business model innovation. And what we see is that especially those players are successful that kind of integrate the value chain and the supply chain in a much more holistic way. Those players that increase resilience through, for instance, local sourcing of materials. Players that combine product and service offerings, similar to car OEMs, by the way. So the OEM model would be one that kind of need to be transferred to our industry. One example, buildings, for instance, could also be based on a few platforms similar to cars. There's no need to reinvent every building again and again. We see also kind of new players filling gaps in current value chains. For instance, circularity has a lot to do with logistics in our industry and also in other industry. We see that marketplaces for secondary materials emerge. And these are all very promising signs. Many of them are actually enabled through digitization, of course. I think two key challenges remain. One has to do with kind of the translation of invention, for instance, new materials into innovation. So the business models are needed, and they're equally important as the kind of the research on new materials and products. So how can we actually develop new business models and scale these? Because what we learned is that kind of not only we, but everyone, things that are commercially attractive will of course scale kind of much more rapidly, and that is a kind of a particular problem in our industry due to very long lifespans. Another, let's say, area that is challenging are tools. So Arab and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are currently developing a tool that helps designers, planners, engineers to actually optimize their designs and translate a kind of, for instance, 3D model into a kind of set of consistent indicators that help benchmarking options against each other, help arguing the business case towards clients, and really kind of quantify the benefits. And these tools are existing, however, they're not talking the kind of a similar language, if you like, and that is something which needs to be harmonized. If we look at the existing building stock, there are, of course, a couple of levers, and many of them have been mentioned. The higher utilization of existing space capacities, that's absolutely key. If we look at, for instance, university campuses, hospital campuses, before they start building a new building, they should kind of increasingly track the kind of occupancy rates of spaces, analyze that, and they would probably see that there's actually no need to build a new building, but to rather use existing capacities, which saves, of course, kind of capital expenditure and saves kind of the environment and so forth. If you look at cities, it's still far too easy to get a permission for deconstruction without detailed analysis whether existing structures can be used into a second or a third life. There's a special focus needed on kind of fit-out layers in buildings which have a super short life cycle, sometimes lower than 5 years. These are exactly the systems that kind of designers in the industry needs to focus on now and kind of optimize them for multiple uses. So in a nutshell, what are the key enablers? I think I mentioned a couple of technical ones, design ones. There is kind of their organizational levers that kind of have to do with value chains, with business models, with integration. There are policy levers, and I absolutely can recommend the recently launched publication of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with the 5 policy goals. And probably a key component for kind of for the future success is the kind of the taxonomy, which is currently being developed, which is kind of literally steering capital flows towards more sustainable and circular buildings. One last key message, actually there's no time to wait. I think we would agree on that. All the ingredients are actually there, and we just need to start kind of embracing that, and that of course kind of requires a bit of courage, especially in our industry, which is very kind of risk averse. And with that, back to you, Jannis.
Thank you, Martin. A lot of food for thought. And finally, I'm now honored to welcome our panelists from India. Anirban Ghosh, Head of Sustainability at Mahindra Group. Mr. Ghosh, Mahindra is an industry leader in both residential housing and mobility. And for emerging economies like India, material efficiency and housing means growing floor space, but in a smart and efficient way. promoting multi-family residences in well-designed cities rather than single-family houses. How can a frontrunner like Mahindra pursue this strategy? Mr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Yanis. Thank you, Yanis. Am I audible? Wonderful. I must first begin by mentioning that it's a wonderful report. Listening to the presentation of the report, I could clearly see that it is something that teams in our businesses in the Mahindra Group will be reading it very closely. Most importantly, because when we are talking about material efficiencies, we are trying to solve a problem which businesses still don't have solutions to, which is to reduce scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and scope 2 are relatively easier to do. And as a part of our science-based targets, we have a very good roadmap to solve scope 1 and scope 2 problems. However, finding solutions for scope 3 is important, and material efficiency is a very big part of that conversation. I must also mention that the report made me feel very good because it sort of validated some of the key investments that have been made both by the automotive business and also by our construction business. The automotive business actually has an independent group which looks at car sharing. It has invested in a new business for responsible recycling of automobiles. And of course, it is the first company to move into electric vehicles in India. As far as lightweighting of vehicles is concerned, it's quite an old program now in our automotive business, because that is the key way in which we drive up fuel efficiency, which in turn leads to lower emissions during the use of the product. So the report did highlight various things which said all of this is important to do. So I'm very happy for my team, for my colleagues in automotive, for doing the right thing. And now I know that they will figure out newer things to do in the area of material efficiency. When I come to the construction business, there are a couple of things that stand out that the business did some time ago. One, of course, was to invest in a center of excellence to figure out new materials, new efficient materials for constructing buildings of the future. So this is housed in a think tank, and the best brains are doing experiments and figuring out new material solutions for construction in India. At the same time, working with the World Bank, we were instrumental in creating the Sustainable Housing Leadership Coalition. And the single most important goal of this coalition was to influence the building codes and standards so that even if a builder did not know what it is to build green, if he followed the building codes and standards, he would end up building green. And for a country like India, it is critical that all buildings built in the future are green, because it is believed that 70% of the buildings required by the country in 2050 are yet to be built. So we are going to see a construction boom. We will need new materials which are carbon efficient, energy efficient, cost efficient, and we will have to ensure that we are building green. So I'm very happy that we've invested in the Center of Excellence and we've created this Sustainable Housing Leadership Consortium. I'm also delighted that the building codes in India now have a chapter on sustainable construction, and I'm hoping that that chapter will grow bigger and kind of go right through the codes that are there in that book. The business itself does take a few actions towards enhancing material efficiency today. I was looking at the various levers to pull in the slides, and I realized that in India, making dwellings smaller is going to be a challenge, because most of our buildings or apartments that are going to get built, individual family homes are very rare. New ones are even more rare, except maybe up in the hill somewhere, or it may be in front of a beach, which is usually a second home or a holiday home of some kind. Primary residences are all apartments, multi-family, multi-storied homes, the new ones that are coming up, that is. And the biggest focus is in what we call affordable housing, which means apartments of about 500 square foot to 600 square foot. Now, those are not too large, so I don't see those apartments becoming smaller. But I definitely do see an effort to enhance material efficiency in the construction of the buildings, like our business is doing, looking at precast technologies, looking at ways in which material wastage is reduced. So in many places, there's a lot of stone or marble or tiles which are used. Very often stone and marble are local materials, so they get used in the construction. So where stone and marble are used, the way they are cut leads to a lot of wastage. So figuring out ways by which they could be cut so that wastage levels are low is one way of enhancing material efficiency. And our teams in the construction business have figured out processes to make that happen. So precast materials, then of course using wire mesh for the concrete roads. Wire mesh while constructing concrete roads helps reduce the material required to build the roads. So these are some of the ways in which material efficiency is being enhanced in construction. I'm delighted that overall there is a change towards green buildings in the nation, and we are really going to task the Center of Excellence to come up with more and more materials. One area we are looking at is, can we create construction material from agri-waste, of which we have, which is available plentifully and which is often burnt to just make way for the next crop in the field. So if we can prevent the burning of that agri-waste and use it to create construction material, that would be hitting many targets. I don't want to talk about killing birds with one stone. It would be hitting many targets with one bullet, shall we say. Let me close by mentioning that there is a very impactful conference in circular economy that happens in India. It's called the Circular Economy Symposium, and it will be my pleasure to have this report discussed and shared at the Circular Economy Symposium, so that businesses in construction and automotive businesses are able to enhance their work in material efficiency, because all of us have to reduce our scope 3 emissions if we have to get to net neutral by 2040 or 2050, whatever our commitments might be. So thank you very much for a wonderful report, and thank you for having me in the discussion post the presentation of the report.
Thank you very much, Anirban. It's fascinating to hear about the opportunities and challenges also in India, and I also hope, like you said it, that we will have occasions in the future to deepen this conversation, because I think it would be very useful for both. We have had till now, I think, a very interesting presentation. We have now a bit of the time for the panelists to answer audience questions. And thank you to the audience for some interesting questions which I have received here in my chat. And I would just like to ask all the panelists to turn the cameras on. And please, if you will be answering any of the questions, try to be very, very punctual and try to limit yourself maximum to 2 minutes. I will try to set an example. There was a question which was more or less given to me: should these business models have priority in the upcoming European Union industrial strategy? Yes. So that's how some of the questions could be answered. I basically very much believe that it should be, and that industrial strategy should be based on the things which are actually showing the way how we can tackle with major challenges of which societies today are facing. But let me now revert. I think it's the question to Edgar, but could be, if you will feel that you need to add something, please do add it. The model shows that construction in G7 will need virtually zero new materials soon. If they applied the strategies. Recovered metals from cars are currently mostly used in construction, but it seems that construction will not need these materials anymore. So should the car industry prepare to reuse vehicle steel themselves instead of selling the secondary material off?
Well, I would be very curious to hear the opinion of the Circular Car Initiative on that topic. Of course, it is a convenience to recycle the mixed steels that come from end-of-life cars. It's really a downcycling in the construction industry. What we found that about a third of the embodied energy gets lost because the alloying elements that are in the automotive steels have no function anymore in the construction steel. And so it's really, from an environmental perspective, would be more desirable to have a closed loop recycling where automotive steel has a second life cycle in the second vehicle, right? And the barrier here is the mixing process at the end of the life. So you would need some sort of sorting of the different types of steels in the car. That means a disassembly of the vehicle. And I know that there are people working on robots who could engage in this work, and maybe here there's a hope with improved technologies that these things could become feasible, but I'm not intimately familiar with that ongoing research, so I would be very curious to learn more about not only research but technology development in this area. Obviously, there would be potentially other places. So one option is, of course, what already happens is that end-of-life products or materials made from end-of-life products get shipped around the world. So that's the other option, is that the end-of-life vehicle steel gets shipped to regions where there's still a need for construction steel.
Thanks, Edgar. Any quick comment from Christoph, if he's still with us? If not, then I go to the second question. Can you explain again the aspect of killing two birds with one stone? How do material efficiency strategies reduce materials emissions, but also operational energy? You mentioned the benefit of using timber, especially in China and India, where there is a lot of new construction. Are other low emissions materials also relevant? For example, recycled plastics or so-called low carbon in cement?
Yes, absolutely. So there we primarily investigated timber, but obviously, especially in those countries that you mentioned, there could be other plant-based materials, first of all, that could bind carbon for a longer time. And we have not looked at these options, partly because there was just a lack of data to investigate their life cycle impact. The same is true for plastics, second use of plastics. But I could imagine, I mean, I'm sort of aware of a number of materials that could be used that have promising potential to reduce emissions. It's just that we haven't quantified that in our modeling exercise.
Thanks, Edgar. Martin, are there examples of recent innovations that really change practices or design in construction? For example, in building management and ownership models to increase efficient use?
Yeah, there are a couple of examples. I mean, one name that appears literally on every conference now is Katera, a US-based organization that integrated the entire value chain from design, production, operation, and end of life. They are doing nothing else than producing timber buildings, like many other companies in Germany do, for instance. However, they have attracted a lot of funding because many people believe in the kind of productization of buildings. So get away from the prototype character towards a more, let's say, system approach, where you would literally go into a catalog and just select a school, produce it, and operate it then in a kind of integrated way. That would be one example, probably.
Thanks a lot, Reid. How can policy incentivize the more intensive use of housing. How can building managers promote better use? You should turn the micro on.
Got it. I'm unmuted now. I think the more intensive use of buildings is both a policy and a societal issue. In the US, we're kind of famous for communities having requirements that single family homes be at least a certain size. And those changes need to come from changes in the attitudes of community members, particularly in their role as voters, so that the policymakers have the courage to step forward and make those changes. So there are policies that can be changed, but I think I think that local government officials who, for example, in the US, are the gatekeepers on this, need to know that they're going to get enough support from their voters before they do that. And we're seeing that in California, in the state of Oregon, in the city of Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota. So it's possible, but it's not just the quality of the policy. I think for building managers, it's a question of what they can do to make these kinds of changes attractive, so that their tenants will want to be in the building. So a lot of that is cleverness.
Thanks, Reid. We have approximately 5 minutes more. Kristina, currently many car sharing and pooling businesses do not yet seem to be profitable and are therefore difficult to invest in, but clearly it is the model for the future. How do you deal with that kind of contradiction?
Yes, I mean, not all businesses need to be profitable before you can invest in them. You know, we've seen that in the tech sector. We need to see, definitely we need to see strong growth, and we need to see future potential for these businesses. I guess we are in that stage currently where we need to understand demand, and is the demand today that maybe have been shaped a little bit by less movement during lockdown periods? Will that return, and will we see growth continuing? And I think with reports like the one today, that will start to make people understand the importance of sharing systems and the importance of people understanding the need that they, it is very nice to have the convenience of your own car and maybe the safety, but there are other alternatives that can be as safe and in many cases cheaper and more convenient if there is more education on the topics and as they're made more available more widely, and particularly in urban spaces. So I think there's a lot that can be done. These can definitely be investable companies in the future, but as an investor, we need to pick where we see those opportunities, and part of that is understanding the direction of regulation and the direction of demand, and where consumers will fall out on that. But absolutely, we're seeing the trajectories towards decarbonisation and more sustainable options are a huge growth area and often offer a lot of opportunities for investors.
Thanks. Finally, Anirban, you wanted to add something to this?
Yes, Yanis. In transportation, it seems investors love companies that don't make profits. Uber and Tesla being examples. But this is only a temporary thing. As the costs of batteries go down, we will see shared mobility businesses being extremely profitable. We run a shared mobility company. We find that cars which cover more than 100 kilometers in the day are always profitable to run. And if it runs less than 100 kilometers today, then their profitability is low, or sometimes they're in losses. However, this 100 kilometers is going to come down very soon to 50 or 40 and so on. So it's just a profitability in shared mobility is just around the corner.
Thanks, Anirban. Unfortunately, I will say, like any moderator at the end said, this conversation could continue and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, our time is over. But before really closing the whole session, I would like to give you, each of you, not more than 30 seconds, a sentence or two of what are actually your major takeovers from today's conversation. And Reid, would it be okay if I start with you?
Sure. Sure. I'm impressed by the level of activity and initiatives across the spectrum in this area. I led the work on the policy review, and I'm very pleased to see the number of different efforts to explore different ways to realize the kind of goals that are set out in this study.
Thanks. Kristina.
Yes, thank you. I'm very excited to see this study broadening the focus on sustainability, both in the mobility space and the building space. I think focusing on circularity really needs to be part of the key focus for regulation, and bringing more education to consumers as well on that front. And I'm really excited by the findings from the report as a result of that.
Thank you. Anirban.
Every solution which is great for business and great for the planet at the same time helps to take sustainability forward and make organizations resilient. Now, we've discovered that energy efficiency and renewable energy lies in that space. I think this report helps us understand that you can do material efficiency and enable a better planet and enable a better business going forward. It is one more lever. So for us, that is a big takeaway, and we will seek to do better material efficiency in each one of our businesses. Our colleagues are already at it, and I'm hoping the report will give them more ideas.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, for me, there are two things relevant. I mean, first of all, we have now scientific evidence, if you like, for things that we were guessing. So it makes it much easier to communicate that with clients and with people that are involved in the industry. And the other thing is that kind of material efficiency and also circular economy as a framework is a great framework for innovation. And that is, I mean, there are so many designers and engineers and students kind of now literally reinventing things with that framework around them, and that's actually an excellent opportunity.
And finally, Edgar.
Yes, I'm really encouraged by the great feedbacks that we have received from businesses, both in developing this report and now in the seminar. And we organized a similar webinar in Norway, and real estate developers came forward to show their space efficient solutions with shared spaces. And so it seems like there is really an opportunity out there that businesses are ready to grab, and this is really encouraging, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great discussion. We came to an end. Thank you to both presenters, my dear colleagues from the International Resource Panel. Thank you to all the panelists for their great contributions, and of course to the audience for listening and asking excellent questions. I hope you have enjoyed it and that you find it also useful. Thanks again to the Green Growth Knowledge Platform for hosting us. Warm thank you in the name of UNEP IRP, also in the name of our strategic partners, World Economic Forum and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, in the host name, already mentioned Green Growth Knowledge Platform, and of course also in my own name, to all who were attending this webinar. And finally, thank you to all invisible but indispensable colleagues from IRP Secretariat and Systemic, in particular Julia, for all the efforts linked to the report presented today and for organizing this webinar, which ran really smoothly due to our gardening agent from GGKP and Invisible Hand Jessica. So, dear friends, that is all. Take care, stay safe, and have a very good afternoon. Jessica, the rest is in your hands. All the best.